one pub ultimately became 100, became 1,000, became 10,000.
Wow.
Because if you think about how do you review 10,000 pubs and think, well, I'm going to start off by driving the car around them.
Yeah.
It's a huge problem. We were showing them on this early version of this software we created, and we were sort of saying, we know, here's the pub you looked at, you didn't like. The site's all right, but what's this bit of software you've got? We're like, well, we built it to kind of so we can do this site finding kind of stuff. And they were like, oh, that's interesting. Can we use it? They're like, you can't. It's ours. I try to have some clear ground rules, which I try not to work at the weekends if I can help it. I try to be home for bedtime. I try to see the children in the morning. I get up early. Sometimes I go to bed quite early as well, but I sort of get up early, and if the kids are up, then I'll spend some time with them.
So, Paul, I heard recently you found £100 million of unidentified value in one portfolio.
Yes.
How on earth did you do something like that?
Well, it was a big portfolio. It was one of the big pub companies, basically.
Okay.
And we basically worked out a way of unlocking value for change of use across very large portfolios, basically.
Yeah.
It was changing pubs to supermarkets. It was changing pubs to residential. It was putting care homes on those sites and this sort of stuff. And so we were able to kind of work out kind of what the value of those pubs were as they were.
Yeah.
And then if we unlock them with a bit of change of use on them, then and it added up 100 million quid. So.
Well, so essentially it's a huge pub portfolio.
Yep.
It's tapping into what else can be done with those buildings.
Yes.
And that significantly increases the value of those.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about background of how you ended up in this, the journey of having conversation with large landlords like that.
Sure.
So what led up to the conversation with the pub chain? How did you end up working with them?
Well, so we sort of started off life as property investors, basically. And we were typically
family background as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, my brother, myself, parents, and we were trying to acquire typically commercial buildings between 500,000 and 5 million. And sort of the reason for that was that at sort of below that level, sometimes you can get a bit competitive, especially on the market. You can get quite sort of on the open market, get quite competitive, really.
Yeah.
So we want to kind of stay out of that marketplace. And then above 5 million, you end up in the funds. So and that becomes quite competitive as well. So there was kind of this block of opportunity between 5
nice little sweet spot where there's less competition, there's less people in that space.
Absolutely, yeah. And we found that so the pricing was better, the opportunities were kind of lumpy enough to make it kind of worth our while, and so hence we sort of targeted that marketplace. And sort of on that journey, we got a bunch of these properties basically, and we had one particular property we had interest from Sainsbury's that we couldn't make fit on our site. So we ended up working with one of the pub companies over the road, had a restricted covenant. It meant that they couldn't do it without us. And so it was kind of a perfect mix for this one particular site, basically. So that all went very well. We built out a convenience store on it and it was all kind of fine. And they quite liked that. And so this is sort of back in 2010, 2012, kind of that sort of time. And sort of pre that in the early noughties, they'd been sort of expanding very quickly. And sort of along that journey, sort of the model they had was the buildings were valued on the basis of the turnover, and of course, early noughties, everyone was going to the pub, having a great time. Then the credit crunch hits, no one's got any money. Then of course, smoking ban came in, no one's going to the pub anymore, and of course, then the value of these buildings dropped. And so there was then a problem of, well, how do we then get the value back up again for them?
Yeah.
And hence the change of use stuff. And so one pub ultimately became 100, became 1,000, became 10,000.
Wow.
And we were then looking at these estates, sort of typically using data to do that, and that was kind of where we were able to kind of unlock value that historically wasn't possible.
Yeah.
Because if you think about how do you review 10,000 pubs and think, well, I'm going to start off by driving the car around them.
Yes.
It's a huge problem. And so we had to use something a bit cleverer than that, and hence the data kind of came into it.
So 2010, for those that were still in property or were in property at that time, we're not really thinking about data. A lot of it's a lot of manual work that needed to be done to find a property, do the research, etc. So how did that come about? How did thinking about data and utilizing data help build the business to what it is now, the property development business? Because essentially right now I guess you describe yourself as a prop tech business.
Yep.
You've got a platform that helps find opportunities, assess those opportunities, target them.
Absolutely.
But it kind of had that start in 2010. What got you thinking about it? Nobody else was really thinking about the project that way.
It was kind of an obvious problem, really. So, if you think about what the pub portfolios look like, they've got 6,000 to 300,000 pound assets.
Yeah.
And you think, well, kind of what does it take to work out what that £200,000 or £300,000 asset might be worth? we need to spend £1,000, £2,000 worth of money to advise get consult to advise you. So of course, 6,000 times 1,000 is £6 million fee, and they didn't want to spend £6 million on finding this stuff out. And
something that has to be done regularly, not really a once in a while activity.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we had to kind of work out a way where we weren't writing these small valuation reports for them. We were just sort of quickly understanding which ones should we look at, and for what opportunities, basically. And so the way to do that was they need to be sort of semi-automated. So we sort of built a process that sort of pulled together the information that we needed to be able to say, well, this is never going to work because it's a stand-up boozer in South Wales somewhere or something like that. That's not going to convert to a convenience store because it's too small. And so we need to have a way of sort of sifting some of that stuff out so we could then focus on the juicy stuff that had changing use opportunities. And that needs to be automated because we couldn't afford to charge them a couple of grand for a report on a property that wasn't going to work. And so it really meant we had to go down that route of profiling, building data sets, and sort of ultimately to use that to sort of filter out the stuff that would work ultimately. And that's kind of the sort of backbone of what we do sort of on a much wider scale now. Is sort of saying, we know what does a building look like that might have an opportunity to add value to it. And how do we profile that with information and data sets from various places? What would you typically do to do that manually? And how close can we get to that with the automation that we've got?
What kind of developments and investments were you doing prior to getting kind of this being your primary focus?
So we did, what did we do? We did things like we bought a Woolworths building in the centre of Warwick. Obviously Woolworths went bust through the same sort of time. So that was, the reason we bought that, it was a sort of a big lump in the centre of town. It was valued on a rate per square foot rather than a zone A basis. So sort of we knew that the retail value was higher if we broke it up in smaller pieces than it was as a single lump in effect. It was a low price. You got a lot of building for what you paid for it, basically. So we did that. We knew of a few little market niches. So we're based in the Midlands, like you. And our kind of hometown is a place called Leamington Spa. And there, that sort of little local marketplace sort of serviced Warwick University, even though Warwick University in Coventry and it's kind of 10 miles away. So that's what the kind of local market was. And so the building stock that was around there was typically a central town kind of retail units on the ground floor with a lot of empty space above it. And that empty space doesn't really work very well for residential. It's kind of too big and it doesn't really kind of stack up to work, and the access isn't quite right because it's not got the nice glossy front door that you can kind of walk through to a nice executive flat. So that didn't really work, but the local market meant there was a demand for students. So we did a lot of that. We did sort of 3 or 4 buildings in central Leamington where we sort of bought shops with vacant space above it, kind of classic Class G stuff nowadays, like sort of the world before PD rights for Class G, where we just converted the upper parts into HMOs basically, so Class G, Class L. Back in the day we still could, but before it all kind of happened basically. So
this was taking a shop that already had a tenant in it, and the top floors, the second floor, first floor, second floor was probably not utilised. And then converting that to something more usable, in this case, student lets, which is what the demand was. And what would that do to the value and not only the cash flow as well?
Huge. So one example we had was Pastimes. You remember Pastimes? Back in 2010, it was a thing. It was like, kind of place your grandmother used to like kind of thing, It's, and so we just sold knickknacks and that traded quite well. So we bought the Pastime store in central Leamington. It was quite a nice deal because the Pastimes covenant was quite weak, but it was a good sort of prime pitch. So we paid back in the day 6.5%, which sounds quite expensive nowadays for retail in today's marketplace. But the value of the upper parts within the valuation of the rental level for the building, the rent was quite low anyway, but there was really very small amounts of money being put into the upper parts in effect. So we knew that if the tenant left, we could surrender that back, and obviously we'd then could change the use. Equally, we knew that most retailers don't trade well from first floor, and so they don't really want the space. And typically, it was sort of historically a landlord that just wanted the problem out of their way. So do a full repairing, insuring lease on the whole building. Let the tenant worry about the upper parts. I don't want it. Off we go. And so we realised we could then convert that to something more valuable. If the tenant left, push the value up. If the tenant stays, we've got a great rental income. Thanks very much. and it was under rented anyway, so we kind of then pushed the rent up. So we bought it off 45,000 rental level, paid 634 or something. We re-geared the ground floor to 67,000, I think it was, and then we got about 30 grand out of the upper part. So we were kind of nearly 100 grand, almost double slightly more than double the value of the rental levels. And we put about 100 grand into the upper parts to convert them, basically. So it was kind of money for old rope as far as we were concerned, because we knew the marketplace, the demand in the location was good. So
it's identifying an asset. So you pretty much paid market value, what would have been perceived as market value at that time.
Yes.
With the view to unlock some additional profit in the property. So today, like using Nimbus, how would somebody go about finding properties like that? Because it's not something that you could do then; it's still something that happens today.
Yeah, totally. So, I sort of liken this to sort of back in the day when I was sort of doing this stuff. Is sort of walking around the building in your sort of leather-soled shoes, and sort of feeling your way through and seeing whether the floor's kind of wobbly and this sort of stuff, and to kind of understand what your appraisal might look like and kind of where you might get the engineer involved and this sort of stuff. And today it's sort of a very similar thing that we sort of do, but kind of from a data point of view, it's a very strange mindset that we sort of live with nowadays. But ultimately, all you were doing is saying, well, how is that upper floor space valued?
Yeah.
And kind of how does that sit relative to the residential values that are around it? And kind of what's that local demand for it? And so within the Nimbus platform, we have a sort of a button you can click which runs this calculation for you across the whole of the UK. It's kind of part of the benefit of the automation that you build, is that ultimately what you're looking for, in the case of that building, the upper floors, the first floor is valued at £5 a foot rental level, so £70-80 a foot capital value, and the second floor is valued at £2 a foot, so it's 30 quid.
Yeah.
And of course the general market value of residential in that area is probably £300-400 a foot in effect. So if you're buying stuff at 30 quid and the top floor was free, so if it's free, and you spend 100 grand, or £100 a foot to convert it, or £50 a foot to convert it, you've got sales values of 300. You're laughing, So in today's market, or today's kind of world, you can click a button, system does that calculation for you, shows you where the opportunity is, and you just in effect go and outbound to the owners to say, well, do you want to sell it? Because I know that if the rental income continues, I've got a great rental income, thanks very much. If the tenant leaves, it creates opportunity to convert the upper parts and to re-let the ground floor, probably on about the same amount that the tenant's currently paying.
Yes.
Possibly slightly more, depending on kind of how that's kind of gone forward, really. So in today's world, there are lots of those sorts of things that are possible, and of course with sort of COVID and build, and some of the messages that Boris Johnson sort of put out when he was sort of in control of the country, those changes to planning then make it even easier. So you've got things like Class MA and those sorts of things where you can sort of basically say, well, where is the underlying rental value and capital value of the commercial space so low relative to what's around it that you can convert to something else.
Yes. So previously we could have found this information through a manual exercise. So essentially what you've done on Nimbus and the platform that you've created is really put all that information in one place. You say, well, actually, this is the price per square foot as retail. This is what it would be as residential. This building is of this particular size, a potential scope to convert this, and just shortens the process and makes it a whole lot easier to identify where there might be a potential opportunity in that building. Yeah.
So kind of in the sort of the old world, you would sort of say, well, I think there's opportunity in this way. I think there's scope to convert the other parts into something else, but you wouldn't really have any idea what the building was before you went around it. So you've got to go and walk around it and get your leather soled shoes on and go and and that was kind of the problem. So how do you find much more of that? So we tried. And our approach was ring local agents and see if someone can bring us some stuff through, and they go, we all know the owners of these few buildings here, and they'd sort of try and get in touch on this sort of stuff. And it didn't really scale. Yeah. Because then when you've got a building in that had been brought to you by one of these agents, maybe the rent was £10 a foot rather than £2 a foot. And you sort of sit there going, well, can I get that to stack up? And it's always £150 a foot, and conversion costs are what? And could we perhaps cut corners on that conversion to try and, so you end up trying to force this thing through because you've had this building brought to you, rather than saying, well, the basic principles are I can afford £70 a foot for this strategy. What's all the stuff that's worth less than 70 quid a foot? Yeah. And then you can be really refined about what you're actually looking at, rather than sort of what we were doing with scattergunning. Yeah. So
what was the transition then in terms of utilizing tech and data for yourself to try and help build your own business, because you're developers by background, investors by background, to make that shift from actually we could offer this to other clients?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It was a very difficult question to answer, really. So what we sort of the journey went on was that we'd got all these pub companies that were kind of asking us to sort of find opportunity in their estates. Back in the days, again, between 2010 and 2015, there were PD rights to convert, so permitted development to convert a pub into a retail unit. So you could very easily take a 4,000 square foot pub to do 2,000 square feet. So you get an extension on the back, and then you get a change of use. It was pretty much kind of a foregone conclusion. You get the change of use. That tightened up, but at the time that kind of worked. You can do it now with restaurants actually, which is kind of classy and this sort of stuff. But so back in the day, that was what we were doing. And of course, what that meant was that we had a lot of interest from Tesco's and Sainsbury's and Co-op and people like that were kind of really keen to take those units off us once we got the conversion.
Because you were having a conversation with the pub landlords, the portfolio owners there, about how we can help you utilise these better and helping them identify that value, and then that raised interest from the large supermarkets. Yeah,
so to unlock the value, we had to pre-let it. We had to get the tenant there. We didn't kind of spec build it. We pre-let it. So we've got them to sign a lease that if we build this, then we'll take this lease off you and we'll pay you 50 grand a year for the rent or whatever. And so that was the kind of model. And of course, as you're going along that journey, you're sort of putting these pubs in front of these action surveyors for the various sort of retailers and things. And they're sort of saying, well, that pub doesn't necessarily work, but we like the area and we think we can make a stack. So can you find something else? And so we went off and we did that, and we sort of wrote some owners and said, we think your car garage over here might work, and we've got a tenant up our sleeve that would work, and we sort of tried to make all these things happen basically. And there was one day when we were doing exactly that for one of the co-ops, the national co-op actually in this case, and they were sort of looking at this. We were showing them on this early version of this software we created, and we were sort of saying, here's the pub you looked at you didn't like, and here's a couple of sites we found. Actually, this owner over here has come back to us saying they're interested in having a conversation. What do you think of it? And we sort of got this reaction. Well, the site's all right, but what's this bit of software you've got? We're like, well, we've built it to kind of so we can do this site finding kind of stuff. And they were like, oh, that's interesting. Can we use it? We're like, no, you can't. It's ours. This is why you're going to work with us rather than one of the other agency firms. And sort of it's all are you sure you mean that? And we were like, well. So we sort of thought long and hard, and we realised along that journey that the things we were kind of interesting for was our ability to use data to find these opportunities. It wasn't necessarily our ability to deliver these things. We're no worse than anybody else, but equally no better than anybody else. And so we sort of realised that actually we should probably say yes to that rather than no to that.
Yes. So just to jump in there for a moment. So what you were doing essentially was no different from what some other site finders do, which is the case of we'll find you a suitable site for this client, charge a fee for putting the thing together for them, and maybe even overseeing the build out. But there's many other people doing that. The advantage you had was access to data that you'd built and collated yourself. Yes,
understood how to scale that and how to find lots of it and how to sort of really focus down on the stuff that worked versus stuff didn't work. And of course they wanted access to that, and so we had to work out whether we gave them a license to use it or whether we said no, we're going to do it. And so that's kind of way to work with us rather than one of our competition at the time. And we took the view that we should really say yes to that. Our clients wanted us to say yes, and we felt we should, so we did. And of course they liked it. That allowed us to kind of invest more into it, so we get better and better at it, and we could put more and more into the software and kind of what it could do.
What did the team look like at that time before you made that commitment? Is your brother Simon and yourself just kind of doing all the work, all the coding, or did you have other people already?
No, yeah. So we'd had this journey of kind of understanding technology sort of on that journey and how it helped basically. So sort of these semi-automated processes and stuff, we need to use technology. And back in the day, it was a Microsoft Access database and then Excel, and it was kind of, and some administrators helping us kind of capture some information and measure some sites and this sort of stuff and search about in different areas to kind of put it all together for us. But we understood kind of how that, sort of the benefit of all of that, and we understood how that was going to kind of help us to identify opportunity basically. And hence we went on that journey basically.
So did you, because both yourself and your brother, engineering backgrounds, Oxford and Cambridge, so would you utilise that technical skills to do the work yourself, or by understanding what's required, enlist the help of other people to get it done?
So we in the early days, we built it ourselves.
Okay.
So, so the journey was we'd got a investment company. That investment company had 5 of us. Then we built the consultancy business, and that had a team of 15, something like that.
Yeah.
And then as part of that, then we started building the software business. And that rapidly grew from sort of the 2 of us getting a consultant to do a bit of coding for us to create some early versions of this into a team we're now at 50 staff, kind of where we've got our own in-house coders doing all this stuff for us. But the sort of the early versions of it were kind of typically me sort of putting some stuff together in a Microsoft Access database, and that getting migrated onto the cloud through consultants, and then sort of steadily sort of moving forward in that way, really.
Yes. So this was so what sort of year was it that you started licensing out to the to clients of supermarkets? And
yeah, so we did our first large scale reviews of pub sites back in 2012. I think was the kind of the first really big one, and that was 5,000-6,000 pubs that we reviewed.
Yeah.
In one go, did it in 3 months, found 100 million quid in the estate in effect. And then we spent sort of 3, 4, 5 years kind of unlocking all of that for the pub companies. The first license we sold to Nimbus was 2015.
Okay.
Sort of towards the end of that, and very rapidly it moved from one license to really quite a lot, and we sort of realised, well, that's really quite an interesting thing, and people quite like that. And hence we then had this kind of question of, well, where do you focus? And we sort of found that running the three kind of strands that we had at the time.
You got the investment, you got the consultancy, and you got the software.
Yeah.
Nimbus at that time.
Yeah. And we sort of found that that there's always a problem in any business. There's always kind of problems, and we found we were focusing on the problems within the various businesses, and those weren't necessarily where the opportunity was. Mm-hmm. And so we felt that really we should be doubling down on where the opportunity was, and trying to keep some of the distractions of the problems that some of the other businesses had, from sort of focusing on those. And so we found we were focusing in the wrong place. And we also found that that we felt people need to kind of be able to pigeonhole you, sort of need to understand who you are and what you are, and notice that quickly. And when you start saying, well, we've got all these things going on at the same time, they're like, well, are you investors? Are you consultants? Are you software providers? And if I give you my data, then how does that not end up in these other businesses that you've got? And how does, if you're working for Co-op, how does Tesco's feel about that? And we sort of realised that actually that it's a relationship game with the property industry. And so we sort of needed to just park those things. They were a distraction. The opportunity was with Nimbus, and we really liked that. And that's what we're very good at. And that's what we were kind of very, sort of very different at. And kind of, that was kind of where we realised sort of our USP was really.
So you've got these big clients, your Tesco, Sainsbury's, Co-ops, and how did you then transition down to smaller developers like us and small businesses that are interested in utilising the platform to find sites?
Well, so we'd got a bunch of clients in our previous businesses, and so we typically spoke to all of our kind of contacts in the early days, and we found that there was kind of a lot of appetite across the whole kind of customer base that we'd got, client base that we'd got. So back in the day, we were finding sites for those sorts of operators. So hence they were interested. We were selling on sites with residential consents to residential developers. We were selling sites, the completed convenience stores, on to investors and this sort of stuff. And so we'd got sort of quite a wide black book of contacts ultimately. And so we end up selling to,
because involved in different parts of the process, your contacts were building.
Yes, and because you might convert a pub into residential, you might put some residential in the car park, you might so you've got the kind of commercial conversions piece, you've got the residential land piece, you've got then the commercial investments you're creating as well. And so we were sort of tapping into all the different marketplaces as part of it. And then we all got sort of the big landowners that are then sort of looking to change the use of these things and getting our help to do that. And so we'd sort of tapped into quite a lot of different marketplaces, and then we just realised that there's various things we can do with these data sets as you kind of work harder and harder to tidy them up, because obviously the government data, so they're typically quite untidy and quite difficult to work with. So we spend a lot of time really kind of cleaning them up and getting them really kind of fit for purpose, so then you can do the kind of stuff that we're doing with it, which is kind of trying to find opportunity in specific buildings in specific locations that really, really works. Versus kind of a generic, well, it might be somewhere over here, there's some opportunity kind of thing. So that's kind of how kind of.
And in terms of your development stuff actively being developed, you kind of wound that down. Because I know you did a site not far from here on Warwick Road.
Yes, yeah. Nearly bought the building over the road from here actually.
Oh, okay.
Owned by South Birmingham College. We nearly bought it off.
Yeah.
But no, yeah. So we wound that down really. So I think Coral Park was when you're talking about. So we built 70,000 square foot sheds just around the corner from here up in Tyseley.
Yes.
It was the worst development of my life. I've got these grey hairs.
I raised that one because I remember you mentioned talking about it before. That was such a headache, and development is not just always a walk in the park.
Yeah, that was. I mean, there were some quite obvious clues, I think, with that one as to why that was a bad idea. Because we was called Warwick Road Trading Estate, and we thought, right, we're going to knock it down and rebuild it as nice, sparkly new sheds. This is in a world when sheds weren't hot and sexy like they are now. You know, sheds are obviously very exciting now. Industrial logistics, you know, it's a crazy marketplace with huge occupier demand at the moment. That wasn't the case when we did this. And it was our first development. It was quite a big one, so it was sort of 70,000 square feet. Gross rent value about 5 million, so it was a big lump for us. And of course, we rebranded it as Cold River Park, and part of the challenge was that there's a river running through it.
Yeah.
And it was all in flood zone 3, and so you're sort of trying to build these. There's a 40,000 square footer and two 13,000 footers, which is an acre. The building itself is an acre in size, the big one. And of course, it's all in flood zone 3, so it needs raising out the ground in order to be able to build it. And so there was all of that. We had a higher improvement line. We had intermediate pressure gas main running across it. We had 3 sewers running across it. Wow. On a 5-acre site. I mean, it's enough for a 100-acre site rather than a 5-acre site. But we got it away, and that was all fine really. So we cut our teeth on our first development with really quite a lot of problems with that site, and needed a bit of grant funding to get it out of the ground and this sort of stuff that we went off and got. So as a 26-year-old, I rolled into AWM and got some funding off them to help sort of get out of the ground.
Yeah.
Really. But no, so we sort of wound that down, really so we could focus on the stuff that's much more scalable. So the sort of working with the pub companies where you've got a portfolio of thousands of pubs, then you could get the interest of lots of occupiers and then create the relationships that then you can unlock value elsewhere in effect.
Yes. So in terms of establishing these type of relationships where we can work with larger clients, your PLCs and stuff, if somebody's listening, watching this right now, how could they go on knocking on the doors of a co-op or a Costa or someone and say, hey, look, I've potentially got a site here, and do they have to go through agents, or how does that approach work?
The agents can help, yeah. You can do either. So there's various places you can find, so you just Google the property requirement. Typically you'll find there's a list of what they're after. They'll sort of show you what they're looking for. And there'll be a contact of the person that covers the area you're looking at, and you just pick the phone to them. They may advertise as their agent, they may advertise as themselves. Often they do both. So, you can Google Tesco's Express property requirement, and you'll find a little flyer that tells you who it is and who covers which part of the world that you're covering. They may put you in touch with the agent, or may give you their phone themselves. They're usually quite hard to get hold of, so take quite a lot of getting hold of. But if you've got a good site, I often kind of recommend that you'd sort of, in that upfront pitch, I would quote to them the size of the site, the demographics of the site, if you can get it. Certainly stuff on Nimbus can show you that sort of stuff. What you're trying to do is to show them that it's real, trying to show them that it's a real opportunity.
Yeah.
And if they believe that, and if they believe you've got a position on it, and they believe it could be a good site, then they'll respond.
So it's not giving them, oh, here's a site, what do you think? You actually give them the research to show why it could be a good fit for them because it meets their criteria.
Yes.
And that's where you're going to grab their attention, really, because it's kind of making their life easier rather than giving them a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I mean, they've got to require, they'll have a target of 10 sites to acquire each year, typically. In the convenience market, that's all they've got. They need to do 10 sites a year, so it's kind of 1 a month ultimately, or a little bit less than that. And they've got to deliver that. And so if you can find them good sites that work, then that's great. They'll get a lot of sites put across their desk, and a lot of it will be rubbish. And so it's sort of understanding what they've said they're looking for and marrying that up and saying, well, here's a site that I'm direct to the owner with. I've got a position, or we believe we can unlock it because this, that, and the other is a position of it. You'll often then get looked after by them typically. And if you can then build a relationship with them and you can explain to them you're doing more and more of this, then that's when they get very excited, because you can fill a pipeline for them.
Yeah.
You're out on the ground doing the the legwork for them and helping them deliver what they're trying to deliver, really. So,
because at the end of the day, it's a challenge for them, and they want to resolve that. So, if you can help in the right way, they're certainly going to be interested in speaking to you.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But Nimbus is involved now over about 12, 13 years now, and is it a platform that's designed for people looking for commercial property that they want to add some development value, unlock development value, or the other things Nimbus is used for as well?
Yeah. So we talk about it's sort of anywhere we can find a way of adding value to property is kind of where we're interested, really. Typically, that would involve some sort of change to it. Albeit we do offer, strategies where we talk about title splitting, buy a block of flats and just kind of sell off the flats on long leases, and you buy 5, you sell 4 for the price you pay for your 5, and you got 1 free kind of thing. We do things like short leases. You buy a flat with 6 years left on the lease, and the cost to extend it is less than kind of what it's actually kind of worth in the end of the day. It's kind of it's margin and this sort of stuff. So we do all that sort of stuff. But equally, we move up into HMOs, we move up into residential land, we move up into commercial conversions, we move up into acquiring supermarkets for, office occupiers, all the surveyors that kind of hang off of the back of that and support that marketplace as well. So we have, for us, a building's a building, and you can change the use of that to add value to it. And if there's opportunities like that, then we're sort of really keen to support that.
Yeah.
And as the market moves, you sort of move into things like EV charging and data centers and solar and battery storage and this kind of stuff, and all the renewables that go along with it. And so we sort of support that whole piece ultimately.
Because you're constantly adding more and more to it, because we've been using it for a few years, and we just see every few months there's something new being rolled out in Nimbus in terms of what it's doing.
Absolutely. Well, I'd say we sort of try to keep our ear to the ground in terms of where people are finding success, and then trying to work out, well, how do we then model that for our client base, so that then they can either be looking at other strategies that perhaps might be better for them. There's sort of what we kind of realised is that there's this kind of pendulum of the property industry, which sort of back when I first started, there was a model in our hometown where you could take residential and convert it to office space, and actually that kind of stacked up. And then of course, everyone goes mad now because everything offices go to resi now, don't they? What was old Class O, now Class MA, change of use, this sort of stuff. Seems crazy, but it was a thing back then. And so sort of as that market moves and shifts, and sort of with COVID, there's been this like drop a bomb on the marketplace, and it's all kind of gone all over the place. As those things change, obviously different areas of the country have different opportunities. Yeah. And so making sure that we're supporting those opportunities, and where people are sort of saying, well, we're getting success over here, we try to scale that out for them and try to scale that out. And of course that then applies in different parts of the country as well.
So if you looked across your client base, the typical people that use Nimbus, what sort of percentage would you say fall into what type of category?
Yeah, so we sort of, we have an awful lot of customers that do some simple site finding, so some kind of easy change of use and this kind of stuff, whether that's houses to HMOs, title splitting, this kind of stuff. We have a big chunk of the marketplace doing sort of commercial versions of that, so converting commercial into residential, doing acquisitions for particular property niches that they've got, and that would kind of then move into some of the occupier stuff as well. So an awful lot of the retailers, drive-throughs, all that kind of stuff. Okay. We do an awful lot in, and the EV charging, this kind of stuff as well. And then the sort of the surveying world that sort of sits off the back of that as well. So
professional surveyors are essentially utilising to tap into the data.
Yeah, so either because they're letting buildings, or they're selling buildings, or they're sort of acting on behalf of an occupier to do that, or valuing, or this sort of stuff.
Yeah. So it's slowly evolved into quite a range of clients, as opposed to a specific type of a client where it initially started with
yes.
your supermarket clients, and it's kind of evolved from that quite a bit.
Yes.
So running a prop tech business like this can be quite challenging and demanding, no doubt. What keeps you driven? What is it that drives you forward and want to do this?
So I think I'm just interested in it. The sort of, I think, approach to nerd at heart, I guess. I get a real kick out of seeing those new opportunities, because I guess you kind of get an eye for what the property opportunity looks like. And when you kind of refine an algorithm to get it so you can say, well, there's where that opportunity sits across the marketplace, and you sort of drop a peg person on Google Maps and sort of, there it is, and you can just sort of drop it on and there it is. I find that really, really exciting. Equally, some of the software stuff that we put in, around the additional functionality that we can create and the scalability we can drive and the insights we can kind of create. I just find that fascinating, really. So so it's largely, I think for me, it's the problems that we can solve for our customer base, and I think it's probably a sort of a deep rooted passion for property. Ultimately, I think there's kind of I sort of talk about this a lot, which is you either get excited by the sort of the ranty smell of stale cigarettes and plaster, or you don't. And if you do, like, property's a thing. It's that kind of and unfortunately I get excited by that. It's sort of, I say it's a ranty smell that is just so exciting that, you know, that sort of smell of change and that smell of kind of new things coming in, and it's just brilliant. So hence I think when you can get a computer to kind of find that for you, I find that really exciting.
What was the reason not going straight into the corporate world after university and kind of embarking on this journey? What was it that kind of led you to the decision of actually, we're just going to run our own business, we're not going to go work for anybody else?
Well, it's a good question, actually. It's a really good question. So I was at Cambridge University. A brother was Oxford. He'd left university 3 years before me, and had started working in the family business. Okay. Which was, you know, property investment basically, and sort of moving into development. I found that quite interesting. I guess kind of, you know, sort of going out together and talking and this sort of stuff. And I found what he was doing quite interesting at a basic kind of conceptual level, really. And so when I finished university, I sort of felt I was quite interested to have a look at it, and I did, and we sort of did some quite interesting stuff in the early days, and I sort of saw opportunity with it, and so sort of stuck with that, really. And then as we then kind of moved through that, we sort of realised some of the challenges that were there, and hence the kind of the journey kind of evolved from that, really. So I found it quite interesting. It's quite a nice lifestyle. Property's quite a nice lifestyle, isn't it, really? So it was good, really.
And what would a typical day look like for you now? I'm guessing very different from when you first started creating the platform.
Yes, yeah. Lots of meetings, lots of trying to align people, trying to get the right stuff done, trying to focus on the right areas. Lots of talking to customers and clients, sort of understanding kind of what they're doing, what they're struggling with, what we need to help with, and lots of kind of supporting of the team. Typically, sort of sales and marketing is often where I sort of get involved, and sort of talking to the customers, understanding kind of what problems we can solve for them, and what the new things are we might be able to do to kind of push that envelope, really. And so sort of I tend to find that for me it's all about product and the ultimate, the customer and the client at the end of the day, that have kind of a sort of a visceral problem that they're trying to solve, and often we can solve a lot of those problems for them. So hence I tend to spend a lot of time trying to get that right, to make sure that we know what things are keeping our customers up at night, and trying to solve those for them, really.
Yes. An interesting thing that I think about quite a lot is, does my business fit around my family, or does the family fit around the business? How do you find that?
That's a very good question. I think I find I try to have some clear ground rules, which I try not to work at the weekends if I can help it. It's not always possible, but I try not to. I try to be home for bedtime. I try to see the children in the morning. I get up early. I go to bed quite early as well, but I sort of get up early, and if the kids are up, then I'll spend some time with them. If they're not up, then I get a chance to kind of prepare for the day a bit more and get stuff sort of fixed before the world sort of kicks off, really. So I think I tend to find that as the business is scaling, there's often sort of challenges and things you've got to sort of sort out. And so I don't think I'm necessarily quite at the point where the family gets as much time as I'd like them to have. They get enough, I think, but there's it would be nice if we could get more.
Yes.
But that's always the case. And I think kind of is a sort of balance of achieving what you're capable of achieving, and the drive to go and do that, and but also not neglecting the family, which I feel like we're getting that balance reasonably okay, but perhaps not optimized yet.
I think as a leader within a business, there's the growth phase of which we're trying to kind of build something. Then it's a case of, okay, we need to kind of systemize structures, and then there might be continuous drive. You might not need to keep growing, but often I find a lot of people are still driven to want to achieve more, or to want to make a difference. And then it can be that balance between, okay, how does that fit around the family? Do we really need to be doing this? Or is it a case we're doing this because we're just so driven and we want to achieve more? We want to make that impact and that mark. So Nimbus is doing so many interesting things right now. So we've been using it for a number of years now. There's lots of other tools that are appearing in the marketplace as well. And, you know, you've got 10, 12 years ahead of most people in this space. What else is in the kind of roadmap for Nimbus over the next few years? What is it you are thinking about rolling out that you can share, and where would you like it to be?
Yeah, so you know, that sort of 10, 12 years worth of experience, we've worked very hard around pulling the right information out of these data sets. And, you know, they're very big, and they, with what looks like a sensible approach to them, often kicks out junk. And so getting that right is kind of a core challenge for many businesses sort of trying to do what we do. It's just a lot of work to go and do it. They'll do it, I'm sure, and they'll kind of, you know, they'll keep snapping at heels, and that's fine. And it's kind of part of the fun of the game that we're in, really, is doing that. I think for us, there's quite a lot of opportunity that we're excited about. I think that drives to helping solve and save more time for our core customer base. Identifying opportunities, saving time, helping to sort of automate some of the bits that they're finding pretty boring. And sort of within any job, there's lots of boring stuff you've got to do. And if we can take some of the load off that and help sort of speed that up and give them access to the right stuff, then we're super excited about that. And so there's more of that coming. We're sort of doubling down on that. And then there's lots of things that there's lots of gaps that the property industry needs filling and solving, and in that vein, and that's really where we're going with Nimbus. There's obvious uses of things like AI that we're doing a lot with at the moment, and I find that very exciting. I think there's some very interesting things that we can do with it, that we're getting very close to building a nice, neat, robust, accurate, resilient database that allows us to do some very clever things with the AI, and I'm quite excited about that. I think there's
so with AI and tech generally, how do you think, or what things do you think will be real game changers in the next few years in the property space with tech and AI?
So I mean, there's lots of application of AI in the tech space, and certainly in our space. We're working on a sort of a validation with our customer base. We've got a big customer base. We talk to them a lot, and sort of understanding where they're bothered. There's some new data sets that we've been working with that are very interesting as well, that kind of drive a much deeper understanding of the building, the building, the site, and the asset that's out there in the built environment. And the application of the AI across it is there's lots of different ways in which that can be. The generative stuff that we've seen with ChatGPT and this sort of stuff, kind of obvious uses of that.
Yes.
Around creating documents that perhaps support planning applications or whatever. There's lots of that sort of stuff. There's lots of things around recommendation engines and this sort of stuff that are kind of clearly quite interesting, and this sort of stuff. And this, but I think for us, the deep understanding of the asset and the marketplace that sits around it is what we're really bothered about. The deep understanding of what the building is, what it's worth as it is, what it could be worth, whether there's demand for that, all those kind of things is where we're kind of particularly bothered, I think.
Yeah. Recently I saw a robot in the shape of a dog that kind of wanders around a building and x-rays the building.
Yeah. And
I was just mind blown in terms of the imagery that it created. And I was thinking things like that accelerate over time. All that data collated will literally allow us to be sitting at our computer and be able to see the inside, what property the fabric looks like. And when we start adding that to the data that's already available, it's almost like you'll be able to do so much just sitting at your desk without even having to view the property to make decisions.
Well, and this is what we did back in 2012, was that we didn't go to any of those pubs. So we found 100 million quid worth of value sat on our desk.
Yeah.
And this is ultimately what our customers are doing now, is they're doing that process just through the interface that we've created for them, versus me sitting there with a bunch of spreadsheets and some people helping with it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so it's perhaps not too difficult to sort of to see that coming. I suppose when you've sat in my seat and sort of done the things we've done, there's sort of seeing the building on the inside is the next level up. But I say we built out 100 convenience stores and did about 250 residential schemes, and I never went to any of them. I think I've been to 2 of the convenience stores. I think I bought did one in Nottingham that I bought a Diet Coke from, and did one in Ingersoll where I took a photo out. I took a selfie. Like, we haven't been to them. Yeah. We had a team that delivered it. We had, and so that idea of, well, can you identify opportunity without ever kind of actually getting inside the building and this sort of stuff? Absolutely.
And you and I were having a conversation a few weeks ago where we were speaking about, or I was sharing that I'm finding sellers are becoming much more amenable to being flexible, and the idea of being flexible around the price or the terms of a deal, certainly more so than maybe a year and a half ago. How do you see the market changing? What do you see in the next 2 or 3 years from as the opportunity from small and medium-sized developers?
Well, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. So, we've still got higher interest rates than we had. Question mark over whether those are coming down, how far they're coming down, and when they start coming down, and that sort of stuff. Those higher interest rates have hit the sort of the more corporate world. So, yields and commercial yields have changed as a result of it. They always kind of sit above interest rates typically. So as interest rates go up, they go up. So capital values for those commercial buildings come down. Yeah. That higher interest rate obviously puts pressure on the landowner and the owner of the property if they're remortgaging and this kind of stuff. And of course that higher cost of debt and the kind of the perhaps the more cautious approach for the banks, I suppose, and the kind of the stress testing the banks are doing, make it harder for developers to achieve land values that owners might necessarily want. And I think that sort of takes time to play out. Mm-hmm. So I think the next sort of year or so will be quite an interesting time, because I think all of that market uncertainty starts to settle down. The big rises in interest rates, landowners will be sitting there going, well, so what does that mean? Kind of how does that affect? Well, doesn't bother me. I haven't got a mortgage on this property. I don't care, kind of thing. But I think the acquisitions piece and the kind of the aspirations and the sort of where the landowners sit around that will kind of then percolate through. They'll be told by multiple agents that actually the price is here rather than here, and if you want a deal to be done, then it's going to be here. If you want to get back to that level, then this is where some of the creative acquisitions sort of strategies come in, and sort of the purchase lease options and all this kind of stuff that we sort of talk about. And so I think that will kind of ease more and more. There'll be more and more of that going on. And so I think it's quite an exciting time, to be honest. I think equally with, residential values will start to settle down. I think kind of they've sort of been normalised a little bit. I think that will start to settle down sort of reasonably soon, I suspect. Obviously been sort of some movements for investors to sell and this sort of stuff with the tax changes and higher interest rates and all this kind of stuff that has been coming through. So I think that will all kind of settle down really, and we'll get back to much more business as usual, I suspect.
I think there's always opportunities. One thing I've realised about nearly 17 years I've been involved in the property space, there's always opportunities in the marketplace, regardless whether it's going up, down, sideways. Yes. You just have to look at the different perspectives. Right? What's the opportunity right now? And it changes and it evolves, and we just evolve with the market.
Absolutely.
I really enjoyed this conversation, especially with a tech background myself. I love this space and the opportunities that it's presenting right now, and it will do in the future. What's the best way for somebody to reach out to you and connect with you?
Yeah, sure. So our website, nimbusmaps.co.uk. If the product's of interest, we want to kind of have a sort of see some of this stuff in action and sort of see some of the calculations and kind of what it shows. You can book a demonstration with the team. They'll kind of show those kind of cool new features that we've got, whether that's finding a student property in Leamington Spa where the upper parts you can convert to resi, and sort of seeing how those calculations work, all of that they can do there. So it's on the website. There's a button to book a demo, and they'll kind of run you through that and show you how.
We need to have a chat about how we can disable the functionality for this area so nobody else.
Yeah.
And there's various different versions, so there's something for everybody there, regardless of where they are in their journey.
Absolutely, yeah. Some light version is just for sort of assessing properties lightly. There's some sort of fully leaded versions that will find as much opportunity as you want, frankly.
So even if you've got hundreds of millions of pounds of portfolio, there's still opportunities there to be untapped.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for
this. Thank you. Much appreciated.